The first scream came without warning, not from a visitor, but from the enclosure itself. It cut through the late morning calm of the zoo, sharp and raw, the kind of sound that makes people stop mid-step and instinctively look for danger. Conversations fell apart. A stroller rolled a few feet and was quickly pulled back. Somewhere near the gorilla habitat, a child began to cry, not because they understood what was happening, but because fear has a way of spreading faster than explanation. Inside the enclosure, Kobe was no longer still. He was on his feet, massive shoulders rising and falling fists, striking the reinforced glass with a force that vibrated through the metal railings. His chest heaved, his eyes, usually steady, observant, almost tired, were wide and locked on something no one else seemed to notice. Zookeepers rushed in, already reaching for protocols they knew by heart. They had seen agitation before. Loud crowds, sudden noises, changes in routine. Gorillas were sensitive, intelligent animals, and stress was not unusual. This was supposed to be manageable, but this wasn't stress. This was urgency. Kobe ignored every calming signal, the soft, verbal cues, the familiar hand gestures, even the presence of keepers he trusted. He didn't retreat to the back of the enclosure like he usually did when overwhelmed. He didn't posture to establish dominance. He stayed at the glass. He struck it again harder this time, and then did something that made the nearest keeper freeze. He pointed, not vaguely, not randomly, deliberately. His long finger pressed toward the viewing area, then lifted, then pressed again, as if the glass itself were in the way of something he needed desperately to reach. "Back him up," someone said, voice tight. "Give him space." Visitors were ushered away. The area cleared quickly, the kind of efficiency that only comes from practice. But even as the crowd dissolved, Kobe did not calm down. In fact, he grew more focused, because one person hadn't moved. Emily Carter stood just beyond the railing, her radio forgotten in her hand. She had worked with Kobe for years, long enough to know the difference between agitation and alarm. Long enough to recognize when his body language didn't match the situation in front of him. She wasn't afraid of him, not yet. But something about the way he was looking at her made her chest tighten. It wasn't aggression, it was fear. Kobe's eyes tracked her as she took a cautious step back, then another. His breathing quickened. His hand struck the glass again, not in anger, but insistence, like knocking on a door that wasn't opening fast enough. "Emily, move away," a supervisor called. "Now." She obeyed, stepping to the side. Kobe's reaction was immediate. He roared, not the territorial roar meant to warn rivals. This sound was fractured, strained, edged with something closer to panic than power. He slammed his fist once more, then pointed again, this time following her movement, tracking her position, as if she were the center of whatever storm was building inside him. The enclosure fell silent except for his breathing. No one spoke, because no one understood what they were seeing. They tried everything. They dimmed noise. They altered sightlines. They brought in enrichment items meant to redirect his focus. Nothing worked. Kobe refused to disengage. He refused to lie down. He refused to turn his back on Emily, even when she moved farther away, even when she disappeared briefly behind a service door. He waited, rigid, alert, unmoving, as if calm were not an option, as if something were wrong and he was the only one who knew it. Veterinary staff arrived. Cameras were checked. Notes were pulled. Kobe's vitals showed no signs of illness, no injury, no external trigger. His environment was unchanged, his routine intact. Everything on paper was normal, except him. And the longer the episode stretched on, the harder it became to dismiss the pattern forming in plain sight. Kobe didn't react this way when crowds were loud. He didn't react when unfamiliar faces appeared. He didn't react to the keepers around him now, some of whom he had known since infancy. He reacted to one thing only, one person. Emily felt it before anyone said it out loud, a creeping unease settling somewhere beneath her ribs. The kind of feeling that doesn't announce itself as fear, but as attention, a quiet internal voice asking you to stop ignoring something you can't yet explain. She searched herself for answers. Had she moved too suddenly? Changed perfume? Missed a feeding cue? Every logical possibility came up empty. Kobe watched her the entire time, not with expectation, with urgency. Hours passed before he finally stepped away from the glass. Not because he had calmed down, but because Emily had been escorted out of the area entirely. Only then did his posture loosen just slightly. Only then did his breathing slow enough for the keepers to stand down. The incident was logged as an anomaly, a stress response, a one-off. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they had all gotten it wrong, because Kobe had not been trying to calm down. He had been trying to do something else, and whatever it wasn't over. As she left the enclosure that day, the echo of his roar still ringing in her ears, one thought followed her with a weight she couldn't name yet. What if that wasn't anger at all? What if it was a warning? Emily Carter had always believed she understood Kobe. That belief wasn't arrogance, it was built from years of quiet routine, from early mornings, before the zoo opened, and late afternoons after the crowds thinned. She knew the cadence of his days, the way his attention drifted, when the light shifted the small habits that never made it into official logs. She knew when he preferred to be left alone, and when he welcomed company without needing to ask for it. So when the incident ended and the enclosure returned to its usual stillness, Emily expected relief. Instead, what she felt was something closer to unease. Kobe had been watching her long before he ever struck the glass. That detail returned to her again and again, sharper each time she replayed it. The tension in his shoulders hadn't come out of nowhere. It had been building quietly, patiently, while no one else was paying attention, including her. In the days that followed, Emily tried to resume normalcy. She adjusted schedules, rotated duties, kept a careful distance from the enclosure as instructed. Officially, the incident had been labeled a stress response. Unofficially, it hovered in the air between staff members like an unanswered question. Kobe, however, behaved as if nothing had been resolved. Whenever Emily was nearby across the yard behind a barrier, even passing through a service corridor, his focus sharpened. He didn't act out again, not the way he had that first day. There were no more roars, no pounding fists. Instead, there was watching. He positioned himself where he could see her. He adjusted his body when she moved. His eyes followed her with a steadiness that felt neither threatening nor passive, but deliberate. It was the kind of attention usually reserved for changes in environment or for members of his own troop when tension was building. Emily noticed it immediately, and something inside her shifted. She began staying longer at the enclosure, not close enough to provoke concern, but near enough to observe. She told herself it was professional diligence, a desire to understand a behavioral anomaly. But privately, she felt pulled by something else: connection. Emily and Kobe had never been demonstrative. Their bond was not built on play or training cues. It had formed slowly through coexistence. She respected his space. He tolerated her presence. Over time, tolerance had softened into familiarity, and familiarity into trust. That trust now felt heavier. When Emily stood still, Kobe settled. When she left, he grew restless, not aggressive, but alert like a guard dog whose charge had moved out of sight. Other keepers noticed it too, though no one said it outright at first. "He's tracking you," one colleague murmured one afternoon, half joking, half not. Emily forced a smile. She didn't tell them that she'd started to feel watched even when she wasn't at work. That the memory of Kobe's eyes followed her home into the quiet of her apartment, into the pauses between tasks. She told herself it was exhaustion, stress, the residue of a frightening incident. But the truth was more complicated. She felt recognized. That realization unsettled her more than fear ever could. As weeks passed, Emily became aware of subtle changes in herself. Not dramatic, not alarming, just small things that felt out of place. She tired more easily. She caught herself holding her side when she laughed too hard. Once or twice, she had to sit down during a shift, waiting for a wave of dizziness to pass. She mentioned none of it. People in her line of work learned quickly not to dramatize minor discomforts. Animals depended on consistency. Teams depended on reliability. You pushed through. You adjusted. Kobe did not adjust. One morning, Emily stood farther back than usual, talking quietly with a veterinarian. Kobe noticed immediately. He rose from his resting place and moved closer, stopping at the edge of the enclosure. His posture wasn't tense, but it was alert. His eyes fixed on her with a precision that felt almost surgical. The veterinarian followed her gaze. "Is he always like that with you?" he asked. Emily hesitated. "Not like this," she said finally. Kobe didn't break eye contact until she stepped forward again. Only then did his shoulders relax just slightly, as if some internal calculation had been satisfied. That night, Emily lay awake replaying the moment. It wasn't affection. She was certain of that. What Kobe showed her lacked warmth, lacked the softness she associated with bonding. It was closer to vigilance, the way someone watches the road when they know a storm is coming. She began to worry not about Kobe, but about what he might be responding to. Emily had spent her career observing animals because they noticed things humans missed. Changes in pressure, shifts in energy, subtle imbalances long before they became visible problems. She had trusted that intelligence in the abstract, celebrated it in training sessions and conferences. She had never considered what it might mean if that sensitivity were turned toward her. The thought followed her through her days, quiet but persistent. She found herself slowing down, paying closer attention to her body, to moments she would normally dismiss. She noticed how often she felt drained, how food tasted different some days, how sleep came harder than it should have. Still, she said nothing, because nothing was definitive, and yet Kobe continued to watch. There was an afternoon when a group of school children crowded the glass, their voices rising in excitement. Kobe retreated to the back of the enclosure, uninterested, until Emily stepped into view. Then he returned, positioning himself between her and the glass, his back to the children, his eyes on her. The message was not lost on the staff. "That's unusual," someone said quietly. Emily didn't respond. She couldn't explain why her throat had tightened. It would have been easier if Kobe's attention had felt comforting, if it had resembled affection or familiarity, but it didn't. It felt like concern. And concern, when it comes without explanation, carries a weight all its own. Emily started keeping notes, not official reports, but private observations. Times when Kobe's focus intensified, days when she felt worse afterward. Patterns began to emerge, faint but undeniable. The more she tried to dismiss them, the clearer they became. She began to understand something she hadn't before. Kobe wasn't reacting to who she was. He was reacting to what was happening. And that realization frightened her in a way the initial outburst never had. Because if Kobe was watching her the way animals watch weakness, then whatever he sensed wasn't imaginary. It was real, and it was already there. The night before her next scheduled shift, Emily stood in her bathroom, staring at her reflection longer than usual. She searched for signs, anything visible, anything concrete. There was nothing obvious. But for the first time, she didn't feel reassured by that. As she turned off the light and prepared for bed, one thought settled into her mind with quiet clarity. Kobe wasn't trying to scare anyone. He was trying not to lose her. And if that was true, then whatever he was responding to had already crossed a line she hadn't seen coming. The question was no longer why he wouldn't stop watching. It was what he saw that no one else had. Patterns are easy to dismiss when they don't announce themselves. At first, what Kobe was doing still felt explainable, at least on the surface. Animals fixated on familiar keepers all the time. Routine built comfort. Comfort built preference. That was the framework everyone leaned on because it was the safest one. But frameworks began to crack when the details refused to line up. Kobe's attention was not consistent in the way attachment usually is. It didn't follow affection or reward. It didn't show itself during feeding times or enrichment sessions. It wasn't triggered by Emily's voice or her proximity alone. It appeared selectively, and it intensified with precision. Emily noticed it most clearly during her absences. On days when she was assigned to other areas, Kobe remained largely inactive, calm, almost withdrawn. He ate, he rested. He showed no agitation that would justify concern. But the moment she re-entered the perimeter, even before she reached the enclosure, his behavior shifted. His posture straightened, his gaze locked. His movements became deliberate, as if he were recalibrating to something that had suddenly returned to range. It was not excitement, it was assessment. Zookeepers began documenting the change, not because they were convinced of anything, but because ignoring data felt irresponsible. They reviewed footage from different angles, different days, different times. They overlaid schedules. They removed Emily's name from the reports and replaced it with variables. The pattern remained. Kobe's heightened alertness correlated only with her presence. Not noise, not crowd density, not weather, not feeding cycles. Just her. That realization unsettled the team more than any outburst could have. Aggression was manageable. Stress had protocols. Even fear could be addressed with space and time, but intentional focus that demanded interpretation. And interpretation meant admitting they might not understand what was happening. Emily was asked to participate in the reviews, though no one framed it as an intervention. She watched footage she had already lived through, seeing herself move through the frame, while Kobe's attention followed with unbroken continuity. It felt strange to watch herself be watched, even stranger to realize how often she had dismissed it. There were moments she hadn't remembered at all times, when Kobe rose quietly as she entered a service corridor, when his head tilted slightly as she paused, when he repositioned himself not to face her directly, but to maintain sight lines through barriers and railings. None of it was dramatic. That was the problem. Dramatic behaviors demand response. Subtle ones demand reflection, and reflection is easier to postpone. The veterinarians cleared Kobe again. Physically, he was healthy. No signs of pain, no neurological anomalies. His stress markers fluctuated only in relation to Emily's proximity, then settled once she left. It was as if his system was responding to a stimulus no one else could measure. Emily started paying closer attention to herself, not because anyone asked her to, but because the alternative felt dishonest. She tracked her energy levels, her sleep, the low persistent discomfort she had been brushing aside. She still told no one, not because she wasn't worried, but because she didn't want to sound foolish. After all, what was she supposed to say? That a gorilla was reacting to something inside her body before she could feel it clearly herself. That idea didn't belong in reports or meetings. It lived in the quiet spaces between logic and instinct, the places people avoided when they wanted certainty. Kobe, however, did not avoid those places. One afternoon, a behavioral specialist stood beside Emily as Kobe moved closer to the glass eyes fixed posture alert. "He's not displaying threat," the specialist murmured. "No chest beating, no dominance cues." "What is he displaying?" Emily asked. The man hesitated. "Concern," he said finally. "If I didn't know better." That word lingered long after the conversation ended. Concern. It implied awareness, direction, intent. It implied that Kobe was not reacting to his environment, but to a change within a specific individual inside it. Emily noticed that Kobe's behavior intensified on days when she felt worse. The connection wasn't immediate or obvious. It emerged slowly, like a shadow lengthening in peripheral vision. When she felt lightheaded, Kobe paced. When she pressed her hand to her side unconsciously, Kobe mirrored the movement with his own hand, not touching himself, but gesturing toward her. When she pushed through fatigue and stayed late, Kobe remained alert long past his usual resting time. None of these moments could stand alone as proof. Together they formed something harder to ignore. Emily began to understand why Kobe had reacted the way he did that first day, why calm had never been an option for him. Whatever he sensed was not static. It was progressing. And from his perspective, time mattered. That realization reframed everything. Kobe wasn't escalating. He was adapting. As weeks passed, the team reduced Emily's direct exposure to the enclosure more as a precaution than a directive. Kobe's agitation lessened, but his focus did not disappear. He watched from farther back, positioning himself where he could still see her through layered barriers, through partial reflections, through movement, rather than direct sight. Distance did not remove the pattern. It only clarified it. Emily struggled with the weight of it, not the fear of illness, but the responsibility of being noticed. Kobe had no way to communicate what he perceived except through behavior. If she ignored it, if she dismissed it as coincidence, then whatever he was responding to would remain unaddressed. And that thought felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. She had built her life on respecting animal signals, even when they were inconvenient, even when they complicated plans. To ignore Kobe now would mean betraying the very instinct she claimed to trust. The pattern was no longer academic. It was personal. Late one evening, as Emily prepared to leave, she stopped near the enclosure one last time. Kobe was seated watching quietly, not tense, not frantic, waiting. Their eyes met through the glass, and for the first time, Emily did not feel unsettled by his attention. She felt resolved, because patterns once recognized ask something of you. And whatever Kobe had been trying to say without words, without language, it had finally been heard. The question was no longer whether the behavior meant something. The question was whether she was ready to listen to what came next. Emily didn't schedule the appointment because she was afraid. She scheduled it because she could no longer pretend she wasn't listening. For weeks, she had tried to rationalize what was happening. She told herself that patterns could deceive, that coincidence had a way of disguising itself as meaning when emotions were involved. She reminded herself that she worked with animals, everyday, highly perceptive ones, and that projecting significance onto behavior was a known risk. But this felt different. This felt specific. The first doctor's visit was uneventful. Routine questions, routine answers. Emily almost canceled twice, embarrassed by how little she could articulate. She had no dramatic symptoms to list. No pain that demanded urgency, just fatigue. A vague heaviness she had learned to carry without complaint. A sense quiet, persistent, that something inside her was not quite aligned. The test began anyway. Blood work, imaging, more appointments than she expected. While she waited, life at the zoo continued. Kobe noticed immediately. The day Emily returned after the initial test, Kobe was already positioned near the glass. He didn't strike it. He didn't pace. He sat upright, eyes fixed, body, still in a way that felt almost ceremonial. He tracked her movements with careful attention, not frantic, not agitated, watching, as if he understood that whatever had begun was not yet finished. Emily avoided eye contact longer than usual, unsettled by the idea that he might already know more than she did. She didn't want reassurance from him, not yet. Reassurance would mean admitting fear. The call came 3 days later. She was in her car parked outside her apartment, engine still running. The doctor's voice was calm, practiced, and precise. Emily listened without interrupting, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. There was a mass, small, early, easily missed without imaging. The kind of finding that often went undetected until it became something else entirely. It wasn't immediately life-threatening, but it was real. Emily ended the call without crying. She sat there for a long time afterward, staring at nothing, trying to reconcile the timeline, trying to understand how something so significant could exist so quietly inside her. Her first thought wasn't panic. It was Kobe, the memory of his eyes, the urgency that had no outlet, the way calm had never been an option for him, no matter how many times people told him everything was fine. The next day, Emily told her supervisor, then the veterinary director, then reluctantly the behavioral team. The conversations were careful, measured, heavy with the awareness that they were stepping into unfamiliar territory. No one said it outright at first, but everyone was thinking the same thing. Kobe had reacted before the diagnosis, before the machines, before the charts, before the language. When Emily returned to the enclosure after confirming the treatment plan, she didn't announce herself. She didn't step closer than protocol allowed. She simply stood where Kobe could see her. He rose slowly and approached the glass. There was no agitation now, no urgency. His posture was relaxed, his breathing steady. He sat down, placing one hand against the barrier, not striking, not pointing. Waiting. Emily felt something break open in her chest, then not fear, not grief, but recognition. A shared understanding that whatever crisis had been looming had shifted shape. The warning had been delivered, the message received. Kobe had done his part. Emily's treatment began quickly. Surgery, recovery. The vocabulary of her days changed, schedules replaced routines, rest replaced endurance. She took a medical leave from the zoo, her absence explained to the public as personal time. Kobe's behavior changed again. Without Emily present, he grew quieter. Not withdrawn, but settled. He returned to his usual rhythms. He ate, he rested. He no longer positioned himself near the glass for extended periods. The urgency was gone, as if the storm he had sensed had finally moved. Emily followed his progress through reports and footage, watching from a distance while she healed. There was comfort in knowing that he was calm, that whatever he had detected was no longer escalating, that he had not been wrong. When she returned months later, thinner and slower, the reunion was understated. She stood in the familiar place, heart racing, unsure what to expect. Kobe noticed her immediately. He approached with none of the intensity of before. No alarm, no insistence. He stopped a few feet from the glass and sat his gaze soft, unburdened. Emily met his eyes, and for the first time since the ordeal began, she felt safe. Not because she was healed completely, but because she was no longer alone in what she had faced. Kobe's presence didn't feel like a reminder of danger anymore. It felt like closure. The staff watched from a distance, silent. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The warning they had not wanted to hear had already changed everything. It changed how they observed behavior, not as something to control, but something to interpret with humility. It changed how they understood intelligence not as problem-solving alone, but as perception beyond language. It changed how they spoke about animals not as reactors, but as participants in shared environments capable of noticing imbalance long before it reached human awareness. For Emily, the lesson was quieter but deeper. She had spent her life caring for animals attuned to their needs, trained to notice subtle changes that others overlooked. She had trusted her instincts when they pointed outward. She had never imagined she would need to trust them when they pointed inward, guided by a being who could not speak, could not explain, could only insist. Kobe had refused to calm down because calm would have been dishonest. He had warned her in the only way he could. And in listening, truly listening, Emily had not only caught an illness early, she had crossed a boundary most people never notice exists. The space where instinct becomes communication. The space where warning arrives not with words but with urgency, and once heard can never be ignored again. Emily didn't like the phrase people began to use once the story spread, saved her. It sounded dramatic, final, as if one moment had rewritten everything that came before it, as if survival were a single act instead of a long, uneven road, as if Kobe had reached through the glass and pulled her back from the edge in some cinematic gesture. The truth was quieter, and because it was quieter, it was harder to explain. Emily's recovery was not fast. It was not heroic. It was slow, methodical, and often lonely. There were days she woke up convinced she felt fine, only to discover by afternoon that her body had other plans. There were nights when sleep refused to come, and mornings when she missed the familiar rhythm of the zoo more than she could put into words. What carried her through those stretches was not the idea of being rescued. It was the memory of being noticed. Kobe had not intervened. He had not acted out of loyalty or training or reward. He had simply refused to ignore something that felt wrong. That distinction mattered deeply to Emily as she healed. It reframed the entire experience not as a miracle, but as a responsibility fulfilled. Someone had seen what she could not, and she had listened. When Emily returned to work full-time, the zoo felt different, not in layout or routine, but in tone. Word of the incident had traveled quietly among staff stripped of spectacle, shared more as a lesson than a legend. People spoke less casually about odd behavior. They watched longer before labeling something a problem. They learned to pause. Kobe noticed the change too. He did not greet Emily with the urgency of before. He did not repeat the gestures that had once unsettled everyone. When he saw her now, his response was gentle and measured. He would approach the glass set and simply be there present without demand. Emily returned that presence in kind. She no longer felt the weight of being watched. Kobe's gaze did not search her anymore. It rested. Whatever alarm he had carried had been resolved, not because the danger had vanished entirely, but because it had been addressed. The role he had taken on guardian messenger witness was no longer needed, and he let it go. That more than anything changed how Emily understood what had happened. Kobe had not clung to the moment. He did not seek acknowledgement or reward. He did not repeat the behavior once its purpose had passed. He returned to himself fully without lingering attachment to the crisis he had helped avert. That restraint was the final lesson. Animals were often credited with loyalty, but rarely with boundaries. Kobe demonstrated both. He acted when action was necessary, then stepped back when it was not. He did not define himself by what he had done for Emily. He defined himself by when to stop. As the months passed, visitors occasionally noticed the calm between them. They commented on how peaceful Kobe seemed, how grounded. They did not know the history, and Emily did not volunteer it. The story did not belong to the public. It belonged to the space between two beings who had shared a moment of unspoken urgency. On especially quiet mornings, Emily would stand near the enclosure before the zoo opened. The light would filter in just right, softening everything. Kobe would sit where he always had, massive, and still, his presence no longer charged with warning, but with something steadier. Continuity. Emily realized then that what Kobe had given her was not just time. He had given her a shift in how she listened to animals, to her body, to the spaces where instinct lived, before language arrived to complicate it. He had reminded her that care was not always gentle, that concern could be loud, uncomfortable, even frightening when the stakes were high, and that ignoring it did not make it disappear. The zoo began incorporating the incident into training not as a miracle story, but as a case study in humility. New keepers were taught to document without dismissing, to question their assumptions, to respect behavior that did not fit neatly into categories. Kobe was never singled out. His name did not appear in manuals, but his influence did. Emily continued her work with renewed patience, slower to judge, quicker to pause. She noticed things she might have brushed past before. A slight change in posture, a refusal to settle that had nothing to do with environment, signals that asked for attention rather than correction. She honored them. Kobe aged as all gorillas do. His movements grew more deliberate, his rest periods longer. Emily watched that process with acceptance, no longer driven by the need to interpret everything. Some things did not need meaning layered onto them. Some moments were simply moments. When Kobe eventually withdrew from the glass, more often choosing quieter corners of the enclosure, Emily did not feel loss. She felt trust. Trust that whatever had once required urgency no longer did. Trust that listening had been enough. People would later summarize the story in simple terms. A gorilla warned a woman. A diagnosis was made. A life was changed. But Emily knew the deeper truth. Kobe had not saved her by doing something extraordinary. He had saved her by refusing to look away, by insisting that calm was not appropriate when something was wrong, by acting without language, without certainty, without reassurance that anyone would understand. And then once the message was delivered, by stepping back into silence. That was the kind of protection that didn't announce itself, the kind that didn't ask to be remembered, the kind that changed everything anyway. In the end, this story was never really about a gorilla who refused to calm down. It was about what happens when we finally stop telling ourselves that calm is always the goal. Kobe didn't save Emily by being gentle. He saved her by being honest, by refusing to soften his response when something inside him recognized danger long before machines, charts, or symptoms could. His behavior was inconvenient, unsettling, and impossible to explain at first, but it was also precise. And precision, when it comes to instinct, is rarely accidental. The lesson here is uncomfortable, and that's exactly why it matters. We live in a world that rewards reassurance. We tell ourselves everything is fine because uncertainty is exhausting. We label warnings as overreactions, intuition as imagination, and persistence as a problem to be corrected. Kobe disrupted that pattern. He showed us that urgency is not the enemy of peace, it is sometimes the price of survival. Emily's story reminds us that listening is not a passive act. It requires humility. It requires the courage to admit that we don't always know what our bodies are telling us, and that insight can arrive from unexpected places. In her case, it arrived through a being without language, without credentials, without the ability to explain himself, only the ability to insist. That insistence changed everything. This story challenges how we think about intelligence, not as something measured only by tests or expressed through words, but as awareness, deep, embodied, and responsive. Animals like Kobe don't analyze the world the way we do. They feel shifts before we name them. They respond to imbalance before it becomes obvious. And when we dismiss those responses as bad behavior, we risk missing messages that matter. But this is not just a story about animals. It's a story about boundaries. Kobe did not cling to his role as protector. He did not demand recognition or reward. When the warning had been heard and acted upon, he returned to stillness. That restraint is a lesson many humans struggle to learn, that care does not require control, that intervention does not require ownership, and that love does not need to be loud to be real. Emily didn't walk away from this experience believing in miracles. She walked away believing in responsibility, the responsibility to pay attention, to respect instinct, and to treat unexplained signals not as nuisances, but as invitations to look closer. That mindset extends far beyond the walls of a zoo. How often do we ignore discomfort because it doesn't come with proof? How often do we dismiss concern because it disrupts routine? How often do we ask the world to calm down instead of asking ourselves to listen? Kobe's story reminds us that healing sometimes begins with discomfort, and that warnings don't always arrive in forms we expect or understand right away. This is why animal stories like this matter. Not because they surprise us, but because they reorient us. They slow us down. They challenge our assumptions about who sees, who knows, and who protects whom. They remind us that empathy is not exclusive to our species and that wisdom can exist without explanation. If this story moved you, it's likely because it touched something universal, the hope that someone somewhere would notice when something is wrong and care enough to act. If you believe in stories that inspire compassion, deepen understanding, and remind us of the quiet intelligence that surrounds us, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing animal stories that go beyond shock and spectacle, stories that heal, challenge, and stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Thank you for listening, and thank you for choosing to pay attention.